Okay, so we've moved on to the 19th century, and we're moving into and taking a look at the Romantic era, which, as I've said in class, is going to span most of the 19th century. It basically runs into and is interrupted by the Civil War in the latter half of the 19th century. We've left the Enlightenment, and as we've talked about in class a number of times, each of these eras is in many ways a reaction to the previous era. In terms of the history, we really need to think about everything that was going on as we go into the 19th century. Once the Revolutionary War ends and the country is formed, things don't really settle down so much as they start to move at a very rapid pace. Um, by the 19th century, by 1800, there are over 5 million people in America. The country is spreading quickly throughout the 19th century. We're going to see this westward expansion. Much of what was going on in the first half of the 19th century is focused upon and kind of the consequences of our ever expanding borders into the west. But we've also got a lot of other things going on. So one thing we want to think about or kind of phrase with this era is to think about it in terms of expansion, industrialization, and reform. Those three things, I think, really kind of encompass most of what was going on and some of the most important events and ideas that were taking place during this era. In terms of industrialization, the industrial area really takes hold now in America. We see a number of industrial and technological developments, the steamboat, spinning mills, cotton gin, which kind of revolutionized southern agriculture, the use of fast clipper ships, railroads, the first steam engine, the telegraph as well. All of these inventions are going to come into play early in the 19th century and really transform much of the country. However, with that growth of industrialization, we also see and start to see much more so polarization between the North and the South. So the fight that takes place with the Civil War in the 1860s really starts to show itself in the early part of the 19th century as the North becomes increasingly industrialized and the South remains rather stubbornly agricultural. One effect of that, among the many effects of that, is that the success of the northern industry kind of emphasized and suggested that slavery was unnecessary, and that made that even more relevant idea of free labor really takes hold in a lot of people's minds, and slavery, obviously, as a result, becomes even more offensive. However, also with the Industrial Revolution, the issue of the workers and how they are treated starts to take hold as well. In terms of society, much emphasis on liberty, fraternity, and equality that were important in the American Revolution became even more important through the French Revolution. The French really took it much further. And so we see this increase of democracy, interest in democracy more so than republicanism. We see intellectual and spiritual revolution as well. So the Unitarian Church starts to take shape and kind of push aside the last remnants of Puritanism and Presbyterianism, as we saw with someone like John Edwards. We start to see this interest in utopian communities and utopian experiments that kind of pop up around the country, where people form these small communities set to kind of be these small, isolated compounds protected from the ugliness of the Industrial Revolution. And along this time, we also see a lot of major reform movements taking shape as well. Not only the abolitionist movement against slavery, but the question of women's rights as well. And ultimately, the question of states' rights. And all that's going to kind of come to fruition, obviously, with the Civil War. So there's a lot of change taking place in the beginning of the 19th century. A lot of disruption. A lot of past beliefs are being upset and pushed aside and dispersed as a result of all these different changes taking place throughout the country. The Romantic era put a great emphasis upon the imagination, and in literature and in the arts we see an increased use of our suspension of disbelief. So we see a greater deal of escapism in literature and the arts. People want to stop paying attention to and thinking about the problems within their lives and within the country for a small bit of time. And so great escapist literature becomes very prominent. We see that obviously with the leather stocking tales about Natty Bumppo. Those are great escapist works of literature. The frontier is often a major part of that. It's a vast expanse. It's a place that most people haven't visited and may never visit. And embodies the idea of freedom. There are no limitations in the minds of a lot of these people when they think about the frontier. And there's obviously also a greater emphasis on the remoteness of settings in both time and space. So again, as we saw with Cooper's novels, the idea of the historical novel really comes into existence here in the early part of the 19th century. It's both escapist in terms of fantasy, but it's also escapist in terms of how it separates itself from the current situation of the country. Also, as we saw with Cooper, and in a lot of ways his work embodies a lot of these ideals, a great sense of improbable plots. Plots were based around crisis points, and if you think about The Last of the Mohicans and how that story moved from one crisis to another and was very kind of thinly interconnected. What's important is those crises, not what happens in between those crises. And so that improbable, fantastic plot became a real hallmark of Romantic literature. And also, as we see in Cooper's novels, these static and rather unlikely characters, they're slightly unrealistic. They're not exactly what we think of as clearly human characters. They're a little strange. They're kind of archetypes in a lot of ways. And they often don't change. They remain static from the beginning of the novel to the end. You see a greater stress on emotion. So this is a major response to the Enlightenment era, where the Enlightenment focused on reason and logic. The Romantic era focuses on emotion and intuition, and greatly on optimism too. Optimism is a major hallmark. So a lot of you focused on how skepticism was a major hallmark of the Enlightenment era. Optimism, in response to that skepticism, becomes a major hallmark of the Romantic era. There's a great quest for beauty, for beauty's sake. People are starting to find some free time to think about these things. No longer are they worried about being invaded by the British. No longer are they worried so much about being kidnapped by the savages. And so they work, and then they come home, and they're able to rest and think. And the question of beauty and serenity starts to become something that people are considering and looking for in their literature as well. And much of that beauty is still found in the idea, or often the dream, of nature itself. Nature becomes the embodiment of beauty for the Romantic era. It is a thing to be, sought after. It is a place of refuge from the pain and difficulties and often sinfulness of the industrial part of the country, of the growing cities, of society in general. And nature is a reminder of God's connection and relationship to the individual. It is, in a way, a form of revelation for the individual. It is something for the individual to reflect upon, appreciate, and thank God for. All of this really kind of comes together, and in Romantic literature, we also start to see this greater interest in style over substance. And so it becomes a much more kind of, we might call it an organic style of writing. There's a much less formal attitude towards writing. There's a lot more room for experimentation. Again, these are not things we would apply to writers like Mary Rowlandson, or even really Equiano. But we do start to see that much more so with Romantic literature. Experimentation with new forms, picking and using what is most interesting to them instead of saying, well, this is what and how I'm supposed to write. And a lot of this kind of compounds itself in the idea of symbolism that becomes pretty prominent with Romantic literature. Again, Mary Rowlandson is not going to write about a symbol or use symbolic writing. But we're going to see that increasingly, not so much with Cooper, but with later writers like Hawthorne and with Melville in particular, Poe as well. The idea of the symbol as a reflection upon what's going on inside the minds, the psychology of the characters, becomes increasingly important. There's also a greater sense of subjectivity in terms of authorial subjectivity and an increasing emphasis on the individual. This is really kind of at the center of everything that's taking place with the Romantic era, the individual as opposed to the community. We saw this start to take shape with the Enlightenment. With the Puritans, it was all about the community. The individual really didn't matter. In the Enlightenment, the idea of the individual becomes important, but in the Romantic era, the individual becomes crucial. We've already seen that with the idea of the romantic hero embodied by someone like Natty Bumppo. In particular, the romantic hero is often a common man who has a need to fulfill his or her potential. And again, we see that with Natty Bumppo in all sorts of different ways. And a lot of this takes place in the kind of political shift, and we'll kind of wrap up here, but the political shift that is taking place as we move into the 19th century. And you can take a look here and see just some of the major historical events that are taking place at this time. Government is really kind of taking shape. We see a succession of these well-known presidents as we think of them today. Congress is really starting to step into its role as prescribed. But the major shift that really takes place is once Andrew Jackson, who was a military hero, who became a national symbol with his victory at the Battle of New Orleans at the end of the War of 1812. He runs for office unsuccessfully at first, but once he comes in, he really changes the political dynamic of the country. Up until that time, we have what we call now Jeffersonian democracy, a system in which an elite, well-educated, wealthy portion of society would rule the rest of society. So he saw a very kind of clear divide, and he really saw nothing wrong with that. He thought that was the best way it would work. So the idea of the gentleman farmer that he cultivated so much in his own life is really what he had in mind for the people who would run the country. Jackson comes in as completely different. Jackson is from a rather poor working-class family. He makes his name by working his way up through the military. He wasn't given anything the way someone like Jefferson was, who inherited land and money. Jackson earns his money, and so when Jackson comes in, we have this huge shift in the country, going from, again, what we call now Jeffersonian democracy, and we shift into Jacksonian democracy, which is a democracy of the common man, a democracy for all Americans, where anybody can rise up. And again, we see this is still with us today. And that is a major cultural shift that takes place. So about 2 decades into the 19th century, America really takes this inversion. And if we hadn't moved far enough away from the Enlightenment already, I think that's probably the final straw that shifts us away from that Enlightenment way of thinking and moves us into this romantic mode of thinking that's going to stick with us for another 50 or 60 years.